Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Want to welcome back to the program and into studio for the first time, Matt Duss. He's the Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. Matt, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. I think I was last year in studio in September.
Yeah, definitely not the first time.
I regret to inform you things have not improved.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess that's true. We were back. Yeah. Was it in September that you were here?
It was, I think, yes, it was September. I'm pretty sure because I had just gotten back from a visit to Ukraine. So we talked about that a little bit.
Okay. We talked about Israel, though. I mean, we've talked to you a bunch. Maybe that's what we're confusing it. But.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that came up. We've talked a number of times.
Yeah.
And that was before October 7th.
Yeah, obviously. No, that was a few weeks before October 7th.
Wow.
All right. Well, let's start with the ceasefire proposal. You've written about this. And you wrote about it, I guess it was about a week ago that you wrote about it when Biden announced it sort of, I mean, surely as a political matter, it was odd to do it Friday night when Donald Trump had been convicted that day.
Right.
Was that just, did you read anything into that at all? Or was that just sort of like, because it was just like, well, we need to do this now. Was there an urgency? Do you think that, or?
Yeah, I admit the timing was. I mean, I think Trump had the announcement of the conviction had come like the evening before. So, and for
right,
Fridays,
I guess it was on Thursday.
Yeah,
it was a Thursday at about 5:30 at night.
Right.
Yeah.
And then this is kind of late afternoon or midday Friday when the president is going to give this speech. But he clearly felt urgency, although Friday tends to be a day when you put out things you don't want people to notice.
Right.
But he clearly, when the president makes a speech, the president wants people to notice. And, the move here was clearly to try and box in Netanyahu and Hamas by putting the deals of this proposal on the table. It contained, I think there were a number of things that were really significant. I mean, this was Biden for the first time publicly endorsing what Hamas has been asking for months, which is a permanent ceasefire. I mean, Biden put his name in support of that, saying this must now end. The downside, and this is part of what I wrote in the piece, is, you're trying to box Netanyahu in politically, but you're not providing an or else if he says no. Right. And this has consistently been a problem, not just with Biden's approach to Netanyahu, although he is particularly bad on this. It goes back. This is a longstanding problem of U.S. approach to dealing with Netanyahu and the Israeli government. It's rare, if ever, we see the threat or imposition of real consequences. So if you're not really going to make it a real downside, what is the tough choice here? And we've seen Netanyahu respond, as he often does, by playing for time, by kind of throwing some provocative statements out there. The goal being to get the other side, in this case Hamas, to pull back from the prospect of an agreement. We saw him, use this play numerous times in past, negotiations with the PLO, with Abbas, where they would announce some new round of settlements or some other provocative thing that would just make clear that he's not talking in good faith.
Duncan Black, the blog Eschaton, which I'm sure I know you're familiar with.
Old school.
Old school. He had a post, I guess it was this morning actually, entitled Progress. And he writes, some movement from the White House, and he quotes 2 or 3 paragraphs from a Guardian piece. Joe Biden said on Tuesday he's warned Benjamin Netanyahu that Israel's indiscriminate bombing of Gaza was beginning to alienate Europe and the rest of the international community. Speaking at a fundraiser, the U.S. president ramped up pressure on Israel over any post-hostility deals. He said the Israelis can't say no to a Palestinian state and urged Netanyahu not to repeat the mistake made by the U.S. after 9/11. And then Duncan Black jokingly writes, wait, hold on, computer enhance. This article is more than 5 months old.
Right.
And so, this is more of the same. Like, what? I think it's pretty well documented, and it's pretty clear that Joe Biden has there's a big ideological element to his allergy towards holding Israel to account in any way,
right,
or leveraging anything with Israel. But do you think they also think that there's like some type of a political danger in holding them to account by saying, like, we're going to hold back X number of dollars?
Yeah, no, clearly. And they are right. There is a political danger. That's not an excuse not to do the right thing. But yes, I mean, let's look at the response when he said in that CNN interview a few weeks ago that he had decided to withhold 2,000-pound bombs from Israel to prevent them from continuing to use them in densely populated areas. Like the backlash to that from Republicans, even from some hawkish Democrats, and including from big Democratic donors like Haim Saban, was massive outrage. So there are clear political downsides to this. I just tend to think one should err on the side of not supporting mass atrocities, but this is clearly playing a role in his calculation, and you add that to, yes, as you said, a pretty deep ideological belief about how the U.S.-Israel relationship is supposed to work, and it's supposed to work in that the U.S. supports whatever Israel does with, minor adjustments here and there.
Well, but the ideology seems to be trumping at this point United States international interests, and I guess that's what I'm curious about your take on here,
Right.
because the Biden administration had been trying to pivot to Asia, as have administrations since pre-9/11 until the U.S. continued to get bogged down in the Middle East. I understand they're concerned about China's rising influence within the region. I know them brokering, by the way, those talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia and cooling some of those relations there may have made the Biden administration nervous.
Right.
My assessment is that this just makes it harder for them to continue to make themselves felt in the Middle East with the rise of maybe China influencing there and Russia as well. But they're trying to almost will it into existence with this Abraham Accords deal.
No, I think what you said is right, and there is a contradiction here because their approach in the Middle East, and this is where the Saudi deal comes in, this big security deal that they're talking about, and they claim to have been getting close to the final terms of. I mean, this is in large part, a play to try to box China out of the Middle East and kind of consolidate or reconsolidate sort of American dominance and American influence in the region. And you mentioned the Saudi-Iran deal. What's interesting about that is, China was essentially kind of brought in at the last minute to kind of present the deal. There was so much work already done that China played no part in. But as I see it, and I think others have commented on this one, well, this was kind of a clever play by MBS to kind of let's say the audience for China brokering that deal was Joe Biden.
Right.
And the argument was, well, listen, we've got options. So what's your offer? And Biden has shown them what his offer is. It's an enormous offer, a security guarantee, a civilian nuclear program, and a bunch of new weapons. But it does, as you said, the costs here to America's global standing, to the relationship that we need to build with the global South is very, very severe. I mean, there is a competition for influence in some of these regions. And, there's a lot that could be said about this Gaza war, but one of the things is it has starkly demonstrated the double standard in the so-called rules-based order that has always been clear to the global South, but this is just the most powerful exhibit one could ask for.
It couldn't be more naked. So all right, before we because I do want to pull on that string a little bit more with Saudi Arabia. I mean, so much of this is the same sort of impetus, it feels like, with the Iraq War, which was, we need to be able to control the spigot of oil. Well, I guess we're heading down this path, and we'll circle back because recently there's been some reporting on what Biden did with the strategic petroleum reserve in this country, where he basically broke, at least temporarily and potentially going forward, OPEC's ability to control the price of oil by basically saying to traders, because he released us a real enormous amount of these reserves, and then ended up buying back and filling up the reserves, making, I think it was $30 a barrel, and we're talking millions of barrels of oil here, and basically set the word out, like, if oil gets too high, we're going to do this again. And if you've got any futures as an oil trader on oil going up, you're going to lose your shirt which keeps people from doing that and keeps and suppresses the price of oil. I mean, I've simplified it a little bit, but that's the dynamic. I mean, so it's not really the price of oil that we're that concerned about here, right? It's more just like, we don't want you to sell unfettered amounts of oil to China because we think we're going to be in a conflict with it.
Well, it's that. I mean, it's oil, it's influence. I mean, China is making inroads, as one would expect of a rising power. That's not to downplay the challenge of China, both to its own people and I think globally. Their vision of a world order is, I think, different from a lot of ours. But, you know, there is just kind of this frantic attempt, as I said, to box China out of the region and sustain kind of American dominance. Sustain a set of security relationships that, if you actually look at them, I think clearly and honestly, have had enormous costs and are continuing to have enormous costs.
But it's also like when we say influence, all we really care about, it seems to me, is ultimately is access to resources.
Or
right? I mean,
preventing China from getting access to oil, and they're more oil dominant than us in the
100%.
energy transition, because we're trying to at least get some EVs.
Right, it's trade, it's transit, it's you know the waterways. It's a lot in here.
And it's when we're talking about this region of the planet, it's ultimately resources, right? Because it's not so much markets, and that's the irony is that we have our corporate interests are all to open up China's markets, and so they're not going to, you know. On one hand, we're trying to sort of limit the amount of, let's say, fuel they have to expand their economy. On the other hand, we have all the corporate interests that are going to be like, well, we want that economy to expand because that's where our markets are.
Yeah.
I don't know. It seems like there's this battle going on that no normal people are a part of.
It also seems like the Biden administration wants to return the region to a period where it was basically the 1990s at this point. And I don't necessarily know if that's possible given the rise of China and the fact that the United States, in its process of trying to continue to maintain its dominance in the Middle East, is alienating the global South by aiding and abetting, my words, a genocide.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to quote or to paraphrase, you know, Rick James, global primacy is a hell of a drug, you know, and there is kind of a schizophrenia to this administration's foreign policy. On the one hand, you do see a recognition that kind of neoliberalism, this trade theology that had guided America's global approach, has failed. And we need a new approach. And there's been some really important steps taken and thinking being done. However, you also have part of it, and I think Gaza demonstrates this commitment, this kind of religious ideological commitment to the necessity of American control, American military hegemony, and American influence defined as strong relationships, security-based relationships with some very bad regimes. And I think we need to question that logic.
This weekend, Ken Klippenstein got a hold of a White House document. And Ken's no longer with The Intercept. You can get his stuff on Substack. I think if you just go to his Twitter feed, I think he's still...
He's known to advertise
occasionally
Substack.
Drop the link, but he got a White House document that was leaked to him outlining the Biden administration's, in quotes, principles in regards to Gaza. This was not a document that had been made public before that. What do you make of that document, both in terms of like its substance and the fact that it's starting to leak?
Well, the document, all things considered, is a fairly good document. It is based in international law. It speaks pretty clearly about the need to end the occupation, which is not a way that Biden himself will talk about it or any of his senior team. So it is something to work with, and it's also important. It holds up, you know, Israeli incitement and Israeli law breaking and Palestinian incitement and law breaking. These are both things that need to be opposed. But to actually move forward on the basis of these principles will require confronting the Israeli government in a way that Biden has as yet shown zero willingness to do. So if this is a real plan and they are serious about it, I'm ready to see it. I'm ready to support it. But again, what is contained in here requires really bringing some real pressure and leverage to bear on some of these policies from the Israeli government that are designed to foreclose Palestinian liberation.
You know, I see all these things that make it seem like the Biden administration is trying to resolve this. But we still have this well, I mean, I don't know how many months ago it was that Benny Gantz came to the U.S. and on the way out,
March.
It was in March, I guess. On the way out after meeting with the White House, all the stories that were in the media were like, he really got his butt kicked. I mean, they just yelled at him and whatnot, which sounded like it sounded like a story that was planted. And then you had Chuck Schumer basically say
Right.
I want, Netanyahu gone. And then they, I got the sense that Biden wanted to be able to announce something by the debate in June to show that he had the ability to wrap this whole thing up. And instead, we're getting a visit from Netanyahu that seems to be scheduled with no conditions, right? Like, this is not being dangled out there anymore. This is actually, what do they, do you have a sense of what they think they're doing? Or are they just this? I mean, because there's a problem here. Because on one hand, they're strong and wrong, but it seems like they're both wrong and weak.
Yeah.
They're not, he's ideologically committed to this, and they're also incompetent, which is a real problem for a guy who, aside from what's actually going on the ground. But in terms of domestically speaking, his whole core brand proposition was I'm the guy who's in charge. I'm not going to,
return things to normal.
Yeah. And so do you think that they think that, are they surprised it's not working? Because it seems so obvious that it's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, that is, what you described is right. And it sounds incoherent because it is incoherent. It is an incoherent policy. But I think going back to what we talked about, Biden's kind of ideological approach here, it just precludes, he has taken a whole set of tools off the table from the beginning. And his team has now had to try and develop a workable policy within those very, very tight constraints. And let's recognize, I'm not saying that let's cancel the military aid, let's suspend military aid, and then Israel will do what we want it to do. I think it is the case that Israel could not sustain this war for very long without U.S. military support. We may change their behavior for better, but even if we don't, I think not supporting a mass atrocity is its own very strong upside.
Yes, of course.
But to go to your question, again, what underlies this, even though I think the rest of us can see that this policy is failing catastrophically, is that Biden, for both, again, ideological and political reasons, thinks it's better, the costs are smaller to stay the course, and that is pretty extraordinary.
Can I ask you about what in my opinion is a misreading, and I don't know if it's deliberate or it's just bad statecraft of the domestic political situation in Israel. So Benny Gantz, Sam just mentioned him, he's leaving the war cabinet, but it could go either way, right? It does ramp up pressure on Netanyahu, but him leaving does nothing about his coalition.
Right.
So the parties that Netanyahu formed a coalition with in the Knesset are the far-right parties led by Smotrich and Ben Gvir. That has been obvious since pre-October 7th.
Right.
So why are we, I guess, wishing that we can make a relationship with Benny Gantz or other centrist parties within Israel to potentially supplant Netanyahu when we've known from the beginning that just based on the math, that it's the far right that Netanyahu needs in order to stay in power.
That's right. As you noted, Gantz was not part of the coalition. He was part of the Security Cabinet. The people that could really endanger Netanyahu's rule are to his right, and they have made their views clear on this. They want this war to continue. We know Netanyahu's own priority to stay in power requires prolonging this war as long as possible. Biden essentially admitted this last week in a Time interview. And again, what is they're having taken the tools of real pressure off the table, they are now kind of trapped within this effort to kind of put political pressure on Netanyahu. But as I said at the beginning, if there's no real or else coming with that, how much pressure are you really putting on him? And if this is all just a way to maneuver inside Israeli domestic politics, I have bad news. Netanyahu understands his own politics better than we do.
Right.
We have been through this. The peace process is littered with the corpses of efforts to box Netanyahu in politically.
And Biden's not going to do. I mean, and it certainly doesn't seem so far like we've been particularly adept at this at all. What do you make of Gantz leaving now? Then, like, why? Like, why now?
Well, I think it's a sign. It's a long time coming that it's just a straight recognition that Netanyahu is not interested in a ceasefire. He is not interested in doing what I think the entire security establishment understands is necessary to get the remaining hostages out, and that is to cut a deal. And I would note this, and in the comments he made, I think it was yesterday or the day before, when he announced he was leaving the security cabinet, is that he was doing it because he demanded Netanyahu agree to the ceasefire. Now, you've got the Biden administration out here constantly messaging that Hamas is the only one standing in the way of a ceasefire deal. It turns out that Benny Gantz does not agree with that.
Yeah, this is I just don't understand how this is. This is how. Yeah, here's Gantz. I mean, this is and this isn't like. You're not reading this is Barak Ravid writing this in Axios, who, for all we know, is writing,
he's the Adam Schefter of the Biden administration.
It's this countdown until when he announces his book deal with, to make Biden look like he has saved the Middle East or something.
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, if
I like
Ravid,
Barak, I'm going to say that.
Well, okay, but if Ravid knows this,
Yeah.
Well, I don't understand what the game is here, because if the Biden administration thinks we're going to turn Israeli public opinion against, why are they behind? Why is Benny Gantz out in front of them? I just don't understand, who is the audience that they're trying to placate here?
Right. I think that line about part of, going back to Biden's speech about the ceasefire, one important thing that he said was the goal of preventing another October 7 has been achieved. He was essentially trying to create a victory narrative. He was trying to create a ladder for Netanyahu to say, listen, did it, climbing down. And again, I think this is part of misunderstanding how Netanyahu operates, which is kind of confounded given how long these guys have known each other. But yes, then to turn around and pretend that it's all on Hamas, it just goes back, I think, to Biden's general approach to how this works, is that the U.S. stands with Israel and the blame is always elsewhere. It is incoherent.
It's totally incoherent. What of the Israeli Supreme Court, and I have not checked on this recently, was supposed to make a ruling about the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. As to whether they needed to participate in the mandatory draft, essentially, that has always existed in Israel.
Right.
Everybody at age 18 goes into the military, I think, for at least a year or two. And except for the ultra-Orthodox. And there's a couple of members of Netanyahu's coalition, I think Shah's, and I can't remember the second, that said that they, the Torah, I can't remember.
United Torah, I forget.
Something with the Torah.
Yeah.
It's big there. Yeah.
Which apparently is very popular in Israel. That they were encouraging Netanyahu also to accept the peace deal. I mean, they're out in front of the Biden administration and acknowledging that Netanyahu is stonewalling this. But is there any connection there? Do we know? Are they worried that their sort of constituency is going to be like, hey, wait a second, why are we going into the military? We're supposed to be, this is when I'm supposed to be reading
we're just
the
stealing
Talmud
land.
right
We're
now.
not going to fight for it, though.
No, I mean, I asked a few Israeli colleagues about this, and I got variations of not really and always possible. I mean, this has been a long simmering issue like this, and again, this agreement with the government and the ultra-Orthodox parties goes back to the founding of the state and these kind of special concessions that were made to kind of consolidate, the project early on. But obviously, this community has grown considerably. They continue to be subsidized to hang out and study the Torah and have lots of kids, and a lot of working, tax-paying Israelis don't think that's fair, and they're quite right about that. But yeah, my understanding is it's not a huge part of Netanyahu's, never discount that. I mean,
Right. I mean, it's
he's-
just probably, I think between the two of them, they may have like maybe not even 10 or 12 seats in the Knesset. But,
Right.
that there's not a huge margin of error in the Knesset for Netanyahu.
Right. There isn't. But again, give him his due credit. This is a guy who knows how to stick around.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, then the timing, that brings us to the timing of this hostage rescue, I think, where 4 hostages rescued, maybe some were killed over the weekend. We don't have independent verification on that. It's what Hamas is claiming. And then 270 Palestinians slaughtered in this hostage rescue. At minimum, hundreds more wounded.
Yeah.
The reports were apocalyptic. Children's body parts in the streets, dogs eating the decaying bodies of people.
Yeah.
Now, we know that the bulk of the hostages were released during the temporary ceasefire. But 4 were rescued here, and this is, I'm sure, something that Netanyahu's government sees as a massive victory. What is the timing of this? Was this meant to demonstrate that the war needs to continue for the return of hostages? And do you feel that the timing was in order to take some pressure off of Netanyahu on the ceasefire?
I mean, I think you have to assume that partly, but I also think part of it is, I would imagine they got intelligence of where the hostages were, and it was an opportunity to go in and get them. Obviously, the costs of this rescue are enormous, and it's frankly disgusting to see U.S. officials out there, praising this as a successful operation. Of course, I'm glad that the hostages are out, but 270 people killed and as many, hundreds wounded is extraordinary.
And reports that it was potentially an aid vehicle that came in. Now, I don't
Potentially
know.
an
This
aid
is
vehicle.
unverified. And there's also, at the very least, there's footage out there of an Israeli, I think it's a Chinook helicopter, landing at the pier. Or taking off from the pier. Now, it's unclear what was going on there. I don't know if they were that was one of the hostages that was being evacuated. I mean, we have no idea. But
Yeah, there's a lot out there.
it's reminiscent of what happened in the wake of the CIA using vaccination programs as a way of getting at, I think it was bin Laden or whatnot. You had, I mean, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who forego vaccinations because they thought it was all
Right, and that endangers relief operations everywhere in the world. And again, just today, I mean, because this, again, I don't know, I've seen some of the rumors out there about the helicopter
None of this
and
is
the
verified.
pier, but we do know that this operation took place in the deconflicted humanitarian zone around that pier. Again, let's acknowledge
And Cindy McCain's organization.
World Food Program, that's what I was going with this, is they've announced that they are now pulling out or at least suspending operations again because this endangers their work. This is supposed to be an area that is safe for humanitarian operations. And again, we have to recognize Hamas being present there, holding hostages there, also a war crime. That of course does not cancel out Israel's own responsibilities. It never does.
There's a story in NBC News today that the Biden administration has discussed potentially, I mean, there's 4 qualifiers for this, right? Discussed potentially negotiating a unilateral deal with Hamas. So they've discussed the potential for a potential solution with Hamas. Do you think that's real, or is that just another sort of lame attempt by the Biden administration? And this would be just for the American hostages. And this, of course, this again would be something that you could imagine the Biden administration thing would put a lot of domestic pressure on Netanyahu because if the U.S. can get their hostages back, why can't Israel?
That's right.
But do you think it's real, or is it just we're just going to float this?
I would hope that they've been talking about this via Qatar from the very beginning. I would wish. I mean, how many times have we sent CIA Director Bill Burns over there, a very capable diplomat, to do these rounds of talks? So I would expect this has been raised in some aspect. I don't know this for sure, but I think the fact that they're kind of leaking it out there is another attempt to kind of put pressure on Netanyahu just at the possibility that this could happen.
I mean, as if Netanyahu's not aware that there's a possibility that this could happen. And he's like, well, now they're leaking it as a potential. So I probably only have like another 18 months.
Right. No, exactly. And let's also remember, like, in terms of like threats and pressure, we had the so-called Rafah red line, which was apparently very, very serious. And that operation went forward and we folded. Biden folded.
Totally.
So why would you think these kinds of threats and pressure would work unless you're actually willing to move forward with
to
real
do one of
consequences?
them? Yes. It's frustrating to say the least, and it's also horrific in terms of watching what's going on there. Let's. I mean, unless there's anything else that you think we should know. I mean, I don't, at least in on this, where we're at today.
No, I feel suitably horrible. I think we can move on.
Well, okay.
We've done our job.
My one quick question to you is, do you think that this has done significant damage to Israel's ability to deter people like Iran and Hezbollah, given the fact that they are so bogged down in Gaza right now?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think what we saw, I mean, it kind of goes both ways. I mean, what we saw a few weeks ago with and I think I came on and spoke to you guys about that, the Israeli attack in Damascus and then the Iranian counterattack and the kind of regional coalition that came together to defend against that. So I think that showed that there is a capacity, if Iran were to move to escalate like that. I don't think they're inclined to do that. And we've seen Hezbollah continue to harass and fire rockets and essentially depopulate Israel's north. I don't think they're inclined to go big, at least not yet. I think they are succeeding from their point of view with Israel and the U.S. continually and increasingly isolated in the world.
I had two more questions regarding that. The one being the Iran nuclear deal. I think we've spoken about this certainly in the past couple
going
of
back
years.
many years. Yes.
Yeah. Have you, and I think at the time we thought, like, this is a big missed opportunity for Biden.
Yes.
This is a failure of competence.
Yes.
Have you revisited your assessment of that in light of just how deep his ideological commitment seems to Israel? In other words, like, it certainly struck me as like, oh, wait a second.
Yeah.
Maybe there was an element of not necessarily wanting to make this deal that was a little bit stronger than I had presumed, based upon the way he's acting now regarding Israel.
I wouldn't say I've revisited it. I thought early on it was a huge mistake not to simply go quickly back into the deal. I continue to think that.
Well, I agree in terms of mistake, but like, as far as I'm concerned, Iraq was a mistake. But if you ask Dick Cheney, he'll go, no, actually it wasn't, and it turned out pretty well as far as the things that I assess these things on. I mean, do you I guess was it a mistake from Biden's perspective to not get back into that deal?
I think their view is they waited. They made a strategic choice to wait a little bit to see if they could draw something out that was slightly bigger and stronger and longer, but that they did eventually make an effort. And I think it's true. I mean, Rob Malley, who was the special envoy for Iran, he's on leave right now. But there were several rounds of talks and reportedly were pretty close at various times. But again, by the time these talks really got serious, you were dealing with a much more hardline Iranian government. I think that's the opportunity that was lost by not going in early, is that you still essentially had the team that signed the deal with Obama back in 2015. And by the time Biden got serious about it, Iran was going into its elections, and so that team was no longer capable of cutting to a deal. So I think their view would be like, well, we tried, and Iran just wouldn't go for it, which is not entirely untrue. I think they would prefer that they had the deal. I think they would prefer, even though its timelines were much shorter, it still would have put a cap on the program, still would have had heavy inspections on the program, versus what we have now, which is nothing.
Nothing.
Israel wasn't in favor of it, but yeah.
Well, the Arab countries, the other Arab countries, what's the are you surprised that they still seem to be like we're not hearing much? It seems to me from Jordan and in Egypt and Syria, for that matter. I mean, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm surprised. We rarely, I mean, these are not very effective foreign policy actors. That's been part of the problem. I think we have seen some escalation in rhetoric, especially from the Saudi government, which I think used the word genocide recently for the first time. But they still are holding to, the countries that have already joined the Abraham Accords, like the UAE, like Bahrain, and some others. The value of those relationships from their perspective, from the perspective of these repressive regimes, is still there. But I think the political cost, certainly for Saudi Arabia, that's kind of off the table for them right now, certainly in the absence of any kind of remotely meaningful commitment on the Palestinian side.
All right, let's turn to Europe for a moment. The EU elections took place, and just will you explain to me that we have the national elections, which are on a different schedule, but the national parties then can also run for the EU Parliament, and those right-wing national parties, in many instances, they did better in the EU elections than they are doing even domestically.
Right.
What's that dynamic?
Right. Let's know. First, they definitely made a strong showing in the EU Parliament. The Parliament still contains a strong pro-Europe contingent, the majority. But no, the far right has certainly boosted its numbers. But there are some specific countries like Germany, like Austria, where the far right made a really strong showing here.
I wouldn't worry about that.
Yeah. When did that ever go bad?
Yeah.
Italy, Meloni is now very strong. The far right there made a strong showing, but I think France is probably the biggest news. Le Pen's National Rally organization made such a strong showing that Macron was decided to call snap elections. And I saw that, and I started to have this horrible flashback because, if you think back to June 2016, there was an election that was called, or a referendum that really didn't augur well for what eventually happened in the U.S. elections.
You're speaking of Brexit?
I am speaking of Brexit. It was conceived by David Cameron as let's just hash this out and get this over with, and I'll demonstrate that actually I'm still in charge. And I see echoes of that here. Macron he called these elections, let's just deal with this challenge right now.
What is the theory? Okay, so now Macron sees the strength of Le Pen's party in terms of the EU Parliament, and so he thinks I better nip this in the bud. I'm not even sure I understand the strategy behind it.
He feels that it's better to go sooner rather than later. He has a read on his own politics that is, I would hope, better than mine. But again, we have some pretty good examples of where this didn't work.
Politicians lose.
They do lose. They do lose. And as I said, they lost to an extraordinary degree with enormous consequences in June 2016. And I have a very bad feeling about this one,
And also both in terms of the way that it augurs for Macron and for this country.
Right. These trends are not isolated. They echo, and they certainly echo here. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. Well, this has been great.
Yeah.
You could have brought a muffin basket.
Can we talk about Menendez? Can we end up?
Oh, yeah.
We can talk about
I don't want to take control of your show. But
No,
Can I
please
say,
do. Let's.
Can I ask you quickly though about India though? That's one thing
that's kind of better news. Yeah,
better news.
Good idea. Good idea.
And
Let's
on
go
better
with this.
news.
Let's go with this.
So Narendra Modi's party did not have the gains, is my understanding, that the BJP that they traditionally. Or that would have been good for him. He's still in power, but significantly weakened. Just quickly, what is your assessment of that?
Yeah, no, I believe for the first time he will have to work effectively in coalition.
Oh.
So this is important. I think clearly he and his party felt that they had the wind at their backs, and would just continue forward with their very ultra-right nationalist agenda. But this appears to have put some brakes on that.
Why can't India be our leading indicator?
You know, maybe it will be. I'm going to go with that.
Yes.
Again.
All right,
Emma,
thank
thank you for
You're
bringing us to
welcome.
this, yeah.
Although Menendez, also fun news, so we can get into that too.
That's an evergreen. So anytime you want,
They found so much cash in this guy's house.
Cash and cars.
yeah, gold bars and cars now, Mercedes, yeah,
Cash, gold
Right.
bars, and Mercedes.
Yeah.
I mean,
A humble public servant.
yeah.
I'm sure this. I mean, but to
You're
be
playing
fair,
the game called capitalism.
He did come from Cuba, so that's the reason, right? Why he's keeping all that stuff in his
Yeah.
house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
It's
can't
just-
trust the banks here.
Right. No, he appears to be sticking with that one. No, there was that story that came out last week, which I don't know why I'm obsessed with, but that his own lawyer confessed, I forget what the context was, that he eats at Morton's Steakhouse 250 nights a year.
Oh, I did not hear that.
Jesus,
Which-
that's a lot of red meat.
I don't know.
Well, they have seafood
emergency
there, don't they?
message from Bob Menendez's colon. Help me.
That's right.
I'm worried about him and getting the Jordan Peterson psychosis.
Yeah.
Well, they also give you a 10% discount on cash when you pay in cash.
Ding.
There you go. So that's probably it. I would imagine he's had like a lot of work done on his house, right? Like that's like a big contractor.
Oh,
thing
yeah.
with the cash thing. Matt Duss. I mean, I want to say always a pleasure,
Thank you. For me too.
but it's usually mixed with what you have to talk
Yeah.
about.
No. I will note some better news for next time. I'll make it my
We'll work on it.
project.
Yeah. Where can folks see? I mean, are you regularly writing anywhere, or is it you had this piece in
MSNBC last week.
MSNBC last week?
Yeah, I publish in the New Republic pretty regularly. But check my work out and the work of our team at the Center for International Policy.
All right. We will put a link to that in our podcast and YouTube descriptions. Matt Duss, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks a lot.
With an asterisk.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.